Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to this deep dive into the Congressional Record. We've got this fascinating stack of official proceedings here from Thursday, May 1st, 2025.
Right. And our job really is to pull out what's most significant for you.
Exactly. The key debates, the big votes, maybe some trends we're seeing, without, getting totally lost in the weeds.
Think of it like your shortcut to understanding what Congress is actually up to.
Today, we're looking at both the House and the Senate records from that one day, May 1st.
And it's pretty amazing what you can glean from just a single day's proceedings about, the whole legislative climate.
We'll be trying to pinpoint the main arguments, maybe highlight some speeches or moments that stood out.
And trace those dynamics where they're working together, and maybe more often where the big divides are.
Yeah, and we'll try to weave in some historical context, too, where it helps make sense of things.
And maybe touch on what some of this might mean looking forward.
Right. The goal is just to make it accessible, insightful, so you can really grasp how these things shape policy, shape governance.
And figure out how you can stay plugged in.
So, welcome to Congress in Context. Okay, let's jump right in. The House. It started its day with a whole series of recognitions that, they really caught my eye.
Yeah, what's kind of striking is just the sheer range of things they acknowledge right at the top. I mean, beyond the usual prayer and approving the journal, you see this pattern of honoring local service, local achievements.
Like Junior R. Skip Baker.
Yeah.
70 years with his volunteer fire department.
70 years? I mean, that's incredible. That's more than just putting in time. It's a life dedicated to his community. Genesee Township, I think it was.
Absolutely. And then it kind of shifted, didn't it, to young artists from Florida and Ohio?
Yeah, Valerie Jacobson, Addison Rich, Reagan Green from Florida's 17th, and then Adeline Ferguson from Ohio's 13th.
With a piece called Lollipop. Makes you curious.
It does. Then you had Valor Awards in Virginia, someone in the Warrenton Volunteer Fire Company for 62 years, Sergeant John Larson donating a liver.
George Sholin for Army service.
Yeah.
It really shows the different ways people step up.
And it wasn't just individual heroics, was it? They also recognized Non-Ketotic Hyperglycemia Awareness Day.
Right. Mentioning Mr. Vindman's constituent, Luca.
Yeah.
That puts a real human face on these, rare conditions.
Definitely. And then Shane's story, that was powerful too. A representative sharing a constituent's struggle, worried about healthcare cuts.
It connects those big policy debates right back to individual lives, doesn't it?
It really does. Then there was a quick mention of blood transfusion oversight, CDC funding, sort of standard public health stuff.
And I thought the clean air discussion was interesting, referencing Nixon and Reagan.
Yeah, trying to find some maybe common historical ground on environmental issues. That can be a tactic.
Invoking names that might appeal across the aisle.
Exactly. We also saw that sad moment remembering Molly McGovern, Congressman Jim McGovern's daughter.
Yeah. Those personal moments, they remind you these are real people, too.
Then back to milestones, a Greek Orthodox church in Tulsa hitting its centennial, established 1925.
And Carol Hamilton retiring from L'Oreal. So community institutions, business leaders.
Right. And Christopher Krepich, recognized for his House service before moving to CMS, a nod to the staff behind the scenes.
Plus the students getting appointments to the Naval and Military Academies. Connor Bender, Grace Anderson.
Jaden Saxton, Charles Knight, William Sikora, looking towards future service.
And then more tributes focusing on service and sacrifice. Captain Scott Leatham, a firefighter who died from occupational cancer.
That's a really important issue. And Dick Young, Navy vet and contributor to the fire apparatus industry, Young Fire Equipment.
Also, Ebensburg, Pennsylvania, celebrating its bicentennial. 200 years.
Local history getting its due. And Sarah Schaller, Carnegie Medal recipient for saving a girl from drowning in Lake Michigan. Heroic stuff.
Then recognition for a retiring Master Patrol officer in Gettysburg, Dennis Bevanor.
And Bill Mathis from Texas, recognized for Army service and his work in public education.
And finally, Maricela Luna, first Mexican-American Latina postmaster of Los Angeles. That's significant.
Huge. Plus, Monica Mueller as Businesswoman of the Year and Fatima Smith for a Volunteer Award. It really is a broad snapshot.
It's quite a mix. A real panorama of American life acknowledged right there on the House floor before they even got to legislation.
But then they did get to legislation, and it was pretty contentious right away. H.J. Res. 78.
Ah, yes, the longfin smelt, the San Francisco Bay Delta longfin smelt, and its endangered listing. This definitely sparked some debate.
It really did. The arguments against the listing, they mostly seem to frame it as, well, blaming the fish for California's water problems.
Instead of looking at bigger issues like drought or water management.
Exactly. You know, saying things like removing the protection isn't going to make it rain more, isn't going to increase the snowpack.
So, focusing on the impact on farmers, on agriculture, rural communities.
Right. They quoted Caleb Ragland from the American Soybean Association, Chris Harner, Paul Kruger, Travis Johnson, real people voicing economic concerns.
And they even questioned the science behind it, didn't they? Mentioning a former Stanford biologist.
Yes, claiming the Fish and Wildlife Service had, quote, abandoned science, and there was that accusation.
That Democrats use endangered species as a weapon against agriculture. Pretty strong language.
Very strong. But the other side, those supporting the listing, they push back hard.
How so?
Well, they called it a myth that the listing has no effect on Central Valley farmers. They quoted a science director involved in the decision.
Saying what?
Basically saying that reducing water diversions for unsustainable agriculture was actually necessary for the smelt, directly connecting water use to the fish's decline.
So challenging the idea that it's just symbolic.
Right, and questioning whether Congress really has the scientific expertise to override the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Leave it to the scientists, basically.
That was the implication.
Fascinating how one fish can become this a proxy battle for much bigger economic and political fights.
It really is. And the vote reflects that division, doesn't it?
246 voting against the endangered listing, 164 in favor. So the resolution passed the House.
Meaning the House voted to disapprove of the Fish and Wildlife Service's listing.
What does that really tell us, though, about how these environmental versus economic arguments are playing out right now?
Well, I think it shows that ongoing tension pretty clearly. Congress asserting its power, potentially, to overturn agency decisions based more on economic arguments, at least in this case.
Raises questions about that balance of power, doesn't it, between Congress and the agencies, especially on environmental rules?
It certainly does. And how much weight economic factors will carry versus conservation going forward.
Okay, moving on from the smelt, Mr. Green of Texas took the floor next. His remarks shifted things dramatically towards constitutional issues and impeachment.
Yeah, that was quite a pivot. He started by mentioning a colleague taking a bold stand through protestation. Sounds like something unusual happened.
It does. But the core of his argument was about impeachment itself. He made a really interesting point.
What was that?
That impeachment doesn't necessarily need a crime or even a constitutional crisis. He used the example of Judge L.C. Hastings.
Ah, right. Impeached and removed even after being found not guilty in court. That's a key historical precedent he's drawing on.
Exactly. To argue that the standard for impeachment is different, perhaps lower, than for criminal conviction.
So what was his specific concern regarding the current president?
He raised concerns about what he saw as a disregard for the Constitution, specifically mentioning due process for gang members and deportation policies affecting Latinos.
So fundamental rights issues.
Yes. And he also criticized the president's rhetoric, saying it could, demean public servants, talking about the tone of political discourse.
That's a broader concern we hear sometimes.
And then the big announcement. His intent to introduce articles of impeachment. To build a record, he said.
Wow. Okay, that's a significant step, even if it's just one member stating intent. Did he mention his own history with this?
He did. He referenced being escorted out of the chamber previously for comments about the president. Adds a personal dimension, I suppose.
And he brought up the president calling for a judge's impeachment.
Yes, because the judge rules against the administration. Mr. Green framed that as a threat to the separation of powers, the independence of the judiciary.
That's a serious charge, accusing the executive of trying to pressure the courts.
So, regardless of where it goes, his remarks definitely poured fuel on the fire regarding presidential accountability and those deep partisan splits.
It really highlights how individual members can try to use the tools they have, like introducing impeachment articles, even if the political path forward is unclear.
Okay, let's switch gears again. Mr. Schweikert from Arizona. His focus was very different. economic anxiety, debt, deficit spending.
Right. And he kicked it off with a pretty provocative claim about AI analyzing congressional speeches.
Yeah, saying the analysis showed a decline in fact-based content. He didn't really back it up with data in this excerpt, but it's a bold claim to make.
It sets a certain tone, doesn't it? Suggesting maybe rhetoric is trumping facts.
Then he jumped right into the numbers. The national debt increasing by thousands of dollars per second, he said.
Paints a vivid picture. And those baseline borrowing projections looking out 10 years. Pretty sobering stuff if those numbers hold.
And he warned about a potential pop in U.S. interest rates. That's a big worry.
Huge implications if that happens for government borrowing, for mortgages, for businesses, everything. He tied it back to his earlier point, too, arguing feelings, not facts, are driving legislation.
Which led him into that classic debate, tax hikes versus spending cuts.
And he came down firmly on the side of cuts, arguing the U.S. already has a very progressive income tax system. That's a standard argument against raising income taxes further.
He tried to pinpoint areas for cuts, too, mentioning healthcare costs linked to obesity.
That's a tricky area, but yeah, trying to identify specific drivers of spending. He also took a shot at lobbyists pushing for more spending without suggesting ways to pay for it.
He compared borrowing under different laws, trying to show, I guess, an unsustainable trend.
And made that really strong claim about inefficiency and fraud being, like, a business model in government spending. That's a serious accusation about systemic waste.
The burden on future generations was another key theme for him. You hear that a lot in these debt debates.
Definitely. He then got into some specifics about healthcare financing, mentioning the Arizona Medicaid model as maybe more efficient.
And explaining those provider tax schemes in Medicaid, it gets complicated quickly.
Very. And the exchange he had with Mr. Roy about Medicaid's history, the expansion, the different federal matching rates, that really highlighted the deep disagreements over that program.
You know, who should be covered, how much the federal government should pay versus the states.
Exactly. Then he shifted to the big entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. He argued their shortfalls are the main drivers of the deficit.
And link that directly to demographics, the aging population.
Which is mathematically undeniable, really. The challenge is what you do about it. He criticized colleagues for demanding more spending without tackling modernization or cost reduction in these huge programs.
He even warned about the debt potentially impacting retirement funds. That hits close to home for a lot of people.
For sure. And he specifically mentioned Medicare Part C, Medicare Advantage, suggesting there might be overpayments happening there. Another area of spending scrutiny. He pretty much summed it up by saying entitlement reform is incredibly hard politically.
Because the beneficiaries are voters, and nobody wants their benefits cut.
Precisely. And he linked government spending directly to inflation and the higher cost of living that people are feeling.
Right, arguing that all this spending, the Inflation Reduction Act, border security funding, higher education, transportation, it all adds up and fuels inflation.
His core message was pretty clear. Fiscal responsibility, limited government, get spending under control. A very comprehensive argument from his perspective.
Definitely lays out one side of the economic debate very thoroughly. Okay, let's pivot now to the Senate. What was happening over there on May 1st?
Well, the usual start. Prayer. Senator Mullen appointed acting president pro tempore. Leader time reserved. Standard procedure.
But then some actual legislative action.
Yes. Interestingly, unanimous passage of a bipartisan resolution for National Home Visiting Week, sponsored by Mr. Grassley.
So, an area of agreement there, supporting families, community programs.
Exactly. And then Mr. Thune gave some remarks about the Dakota Relays honoring a coach. A nice local touch.
But the tone shifted pretty quickly after that, didn't it?
It did. Mr. Brown came out swinging against President Trump's tariffs and the Republicans supporting them.
Asking retailers to be transparent about price increases due to tariffs. That connects policy directly to consumers' wallets.
Right. Then Mr. Wyden voiced strong concerns about Social Security, warning about Republican actions potentially undermining it.
And he criticized the administration and specifically mentioned the nominee, Frank Visigliano, and a whistleblower. Sounds like a brewing fight over Social Security leadership.
It does. But then Mr. Rounds offered a completely different take, defending President Trump's first 100 days, highlighting border security and deportations as successes.
So starkly opposing views on the previous administration right there on the floor.
Absolutely. Mr. Van Hollen also urged a vote against some resolution he felt would undermine community safety. The specifics weren't clear, but it signaled another likely partisan clash.
There was also a vote mentioned, SJ Res 31, Something about energy standards for commercial fridges.
Yeah, shows they're dealing with those kinds of specific regulatory issues too, though we don't have the vote result here.
Then things got really heated around the Department of Defense, it seems. Mr. Durbin raised alarms.
Serious alarms. He described chaos under Secretary Pete Hegseth, mentioning staff resignations, paranoia, threats to military leaders, firings, painting a picture of dysfunction.
Wow. But then Mr. Haggerty had a completely different view.
Diametrically opposed. He defended Hegseth, saying he was cleaning up a complete, absolute mess, getting rid of DEI initiatives and refocusing on warfighting.
So again, just night and day perspectives on the same situation, depending on who you ask.
Exactly. And that fight over the Social Security nominee resurfaced, with Mr. Crapo urging confirmation for Frank Bisignano, directly contradicting Wyden's earlier warnings.
That confirmation vote was clearly going to be contentious.
Seems so. We also saw Mrs. Rosen paying tribute to Elaine Wynn in Las Vegas, another example of recognizing prominent community figures.
And Mr. Cornyn laid out Republican goals for budget reconciliation. What were those?
Preventing tax hikes and reforming welfare work requirements. He brought up the TANF reforms from the Clinton era as a model.
And expressed concern about Obama-era waivers and the number of non-working, able-bodied adults on Medicaid.
Right, framing it as needing to restore work requirements for certain benefit recipients, an ongoing debate.
The Senate also dealt with some foreign policy and defense matters.
Yep, considering a missile sale to Poland. And Mr. Reid introduced a bill about corporate bonuses, the Stop Subsidizing Multi-Million-Dollar Corporate Bonuses Act.
And Mr. Kane submitted a resolution asking for info on human rights in El Salvador. So, oversight on foreign affairs, too.
Plus, some unanimous agreements on congratulating sports teams, Oklahoma women's gymnastics, Yukon women's basketball, and expressing support for Romania and Moldova against Russian interference.
Fighting common ground where they can.
Seems like it. They authorized committee meetings, set the schedule, including that vote on the Bisignano nomination for the following Tuesday.
And there was a recognition from Mr. LaMalfa for John Adams Academy and reports on congressional travel. Lots of smaller items, too.
Standard end-of-day business, wrapping things up.
Okay. Quite a day in both chambers. Let's try to sort of pull this together for you, the listener.
So in the House, what you saw was this mix, right? Honoring constituents, local heroes, community milestones.
But also these really sharp partisan debates. The Longfin smelt vote being a prime example of environment versus economy.
And Mr. Green raising the specter of impeachment, focusing on constitutional rights, plus Mr. Schweikert's very detailed warning about debt and spending.
Yeah, a lot of focus on oversight, symbolic votes, and these fundamental arguments about government's role and finances.
Then over in the Senate, a similar dynamic. Some legislative action, like on home visiting and maybe those energy standards.
And also really heated arguments about presidential policies, tariffs, the DOD leadership under Hegseth, the future of Social Security with that Bisignano nomination fight.
There were those bipartisan moments like the resolution on home visiting or congratulating teams, but the clashes over major policy directions were pretty stark.
And those personal tributes sprinkled throughout both chambers just remind you there are individuals behind all this policy.
So here's why this matters for you. Following these debates, whether it's environmental rules, healthcare funding, constitutional powers, fiscal responsibility, it gives you the background you need.
Right, the context to evaluate what you hear in the news, to understand the different arguments, and ultimately to hold your own representatives accountable.
Noticing where they agree, and maybe more importantly, where the deep disagreements lie, helps you analyze the whole political landscape more effectively.
So, looking ahead from this one day, what can we see?
Well, the fights over spending and the national debt aren't going away. That's going to shape everything. Mr. Schweikert laid out one whole side of that argument.
The smelt vote, while specific, points to that larger tension between environment and economy that keeps coming up.
And the scrutiny we saw over presidential appointments like Bisignano or actions at the DOD, that highlights the ongoing checks and balances, or at least the attempts at them.
It really shows how much is happening. This was just one day in the Congressional Record.
It's a massive amount of information out there. If you want to stay informed, checking the record online periodically is one way. It's all public.
Or following news sources that really dig into the legislative process, not just the headlines, and maybe organizations that track specific policy areas you care about.
Definitely. It helps you connect the dots.
Okay, a final thought to leave you with. Think about all those seemingly routine parts we mentioned, the prayers, the recognitions, the procedural stuff.
Yeah, how do those pieces, the framework of the day, actually contribute to the overall process? What do they tell us about the values or priorities embedded in these institutions?
It's sort of a reminder that being truly informed means looking beyond just the big votes or the fiery speeches.
It's about understanding the whole picture, the context, the full spectrum of what Congress does day in and day out.